It's been a long time, but welcome. History of England, episode 36. Damn the Papists, full speed ahead. Now, last time we talked, a long time ago, I looked at the two final wars of Henry VIII. The one between Scotland and England, a victory. The one between France and England, a draw. I looked at the last few moments that Henry did with the English Reformation, steps backwards toward Orthodox Catholicism, and how he protected both his Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, and his wife, Catherine Parr, from the heresy trials led by Stephen Gardiner, the Bishop of Winchester. Finally, I looked at the last days of Henry VIII and the things the Reformers and the new man did on his death to try to get their view pointed across and control the new teenage king, Edward VI, who we'll turn to look at now. Now, I say teenage king, he's actually only 9, but, a few years here and there. Anyway, on February 20th, 1547, King Edward VI was officially crowned at Westminster Abbey. Everyone was glad he was king, nobles to the common people. They saw Edward, as I said, he was only 9, as the second coming of Josiah. Now, Josiah, from the Old Testament, had been the son of Ammon, who took over the throne of Judah at age 8, tore down the graven images of the Syrian cults, and broke the altars into dust. In his reign, the true law of God was found and became the law. So many saw that Edward would be a godly king, just like Josiah, and would do for England what Josiah had done for Judah. Now, Edward stated that his regency council would be made up of the same people who had been around Henry in his last days. However, Stephen Gardiner soon found he was no longer wanted, and Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, was still sitting in Tower London, charged with treason, and waiting for King Edward VI to sign his death warrant, something that Edward really never got around to doing. The protector, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, dominated the proceedings of the Regency Council, and he became king in all but name. Now, he'd ordered 2 gilt maces to always be borne in procession before him, and he had Catherine Parr, the widow of Henry, hand over her royal jewels to his wife, Anne. Now, Somerset had a bad relation with his brother, Thomas Seymour. Thomas Seymour had been appointed Lord High Admiral for life. Thomas Seymour demanded that he be made governor to the young Edward VI. He was, after all, his uncle. But Somerset arranged for him to be given a seat on the Regency Council and promised to share the spoils of office. Thomas was not satisfied. He began to plot against the rule of his brother, and we will get back to that. Now that King Henry VIII was dead, Thomas Seymour, who had loved Catherine Parr before Henry had ordered her to marry him, quickly acted to marry the royal widow and queen mother. This is seen as very unseemly. It was felt that she should wait at least 9 months, just in case Henry managed to impregnate her in his final days. If she did become pregnant by Thomas, there's no DNA testing. The case could be made the child's Henry's, which would insert that child into succession right after Edward, which would bump down Lady Mary and Lady Elizabeth, who would livid at this development. But Thomas Seymour managed to win the favor of King Edward VI. He made private visits to him, gave him gifts of money so that Edward could in turn give these gifts to his servants and feel like he was an adult. Edward Seymour was not bothering to give the young king even so much as a small allowance. Because of this, Thomas managed to get King Edward's permission to marry his stepmother, which was done in May 1547, way too soon for many people, and many began to turn away from the couple at court. Anne, the wife of Edward Seymour, refused to give back the royal jewels. Edward Seymour refused to step down and give the position of protector to Catherine Parr, even though technically she had full rights to the position by tradition. Now, Edward Seymour was a religious reformer. He surrounded himself with people of that type. For instance, his personal doctor, William Turner, had published works that had been banned under Henry VIII. Edward's 6 daughters had been given a good humanist evangelical education, and in one of his proclamations, he warned parents to keep children from playing games like bowling or tennis, showing that he had a puritanical attitude. 10 days before Edward VI was officially crowned, the wardens and curates of St. Martin's in London tore down all the images of saints and whitewashed the paintings on the walls. But they had acted too quickly. They were arrested and thrown into the Tower of London for a time. But there was change happening. It was noted, for instance, that Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, was seen eating meat openly during Lent. Now, Cranmer stated he and all other bishops of the Church of England should renew their commissions with King Edward. They were government officials, not successors of the apostles. He was saying the Church of England was a state church. The pulpits were to be used to publish the decrees and desires of the Regency Council. Edward VI himself is the first king to be given the title of Supreme Head in the English Church. In 1547, Cranmer began to grow a beard. Now, he said this was a sign of mourning for Henry VIII, but in fact, it was soon noted that many of the reformer clergy grew beards as a way to distance themselves from the tonsulled, clean-shaven Catholic priests. And Cranmer announced that after long meditation, he was rejecting the idea of the real presence in the Eucharist. He invited several famous Protestant reformers to England and gave them important professional chairs in Oxford and Cambridge. During the reign of Edward VI, about 70 European preachers, scholars, humanists, and pastors came to England, and they kept up a steady, enthusiastic correspondence with their colleagues still in mainland Europe. In fact, it seemed for a time the young Edward might eventually come to lead a great movement of European Protestantism. Protestant refugees fleeing from the persecution of Charles V came to England, and a group of Flemish settlers who granted the Church of Austrian friars in London as their own. A colony of Walloon weavers was also established in the ruins of Glastonbury Abbey, and during the days that Somerset was protector, not one person, not one, was executed or tortured for religious opinions, a unique period in English history at that time. Now, many of these European refugees and scholars had been influenced by John Calvin, who had established a reforming movement of great sternness and discipline in Geneva. Now, Calvin was a French scholar who had discovered a gift of systematic theology and government. Now, when he was 26 years old in 1536, he published the Institutes of the Christian Religion, in which he established the principles of a new city of God on earth. In relative isolation of only a short period of time, he developed an entire theology. A theology that was often impersonal and ruled by one, but there's nothing private about Calvin. He was always in your face. Calvin fled France, and he traveled to Basel and then Strasbourg before ending up in Geneva, where he established a new republic founded upon faith. He regulated worship and created a liturgy, and through his city council kept watch over the morals of the city. Now, although the second generation of reformers, he is perhaps the most important one, because Calvin revised the spirit and progress of the Reformation when Luther was starting to take a step back, and others had come and gone. Now, at the heart of Calvinism was the doctrine of predestination, which he saw in the writings of Paul and Augustine. This doctrine stated that before creation, God had decreed that some would be saved for everlasting life and some would be damned eternally. Since God is almighty, then he already knew who was in what camp, and therefore while some who embraced this doctrine might fear they are destined for hell, many followers of Calvin saw foreknowledge and predestination as a cure for anxiety and apathy. This faith was now the faith that was being promoted in England, in particular the churches established by the European reformers who had fled the wrath of Charles V, a doctrine that naturally attracted enthusiastic idealists. since they are the people who worked wonderful changes in the world as they helped spread Calvinism. This doctrine soon became established in Poland, Bohemia, the Dutch Netherlands, and the Palatinate. With King Edward VI on the throne, some of the more ardent radical spirits came out of the shadows where Henry had forced them, and into the light and into power. These men included Hugh Latimer, who was released from the Tower of London by Edward. Latimer went to live with Archbishop Cranmer in Lambeth Palace and began to preach once more, denouncing those prelates who refused the Reformed faith as greedy people who would rather have power than do their God-given job. The more devout Catholics fled to France or Italy, taking with them their relics. Among them were the monks who had survived Henry but now fled with their goods on their backs. Others who did not have the money to flee simply killed themselves. Sadly. In the spring of 1547, 3 months after he was crowned, Edward's Regency Council issued a set of injunctions to purify the church. Every picture to be removed from the walls, every image to be put away. Rosaries no longer to be used. There's going to be no more lighting of candles, no more kneeling at images. All were denounced as superstitious. Processions to shrines were outlawed. The more radical parishes of London saw the stained glass windows smashed. In Wenlock, Shropshire, the bones of a local saint were thrown into a bonfire. In Norwich, idle people searched the various churches for idolatrous images. In Durham, it was decreed that there was to be no more organ music in the church service. This injunction also ordered the use of English litany, the reading of the Bible in English. Every church was to buy 1 copy of Erasmus's paraphrase of the New Testament and 1 copy of Thomas Cranmer's Book of Homilies, which would be read on 12 successive Sundays as they talked about the principal doctrines of the Church of England. Mass no longer to be mentioned. Baptism only referenced if needed. The main source of strength, the main source of power, lay in the reading of the Bible. And all of this helped to ease the introduction of new faith with English people. In May 1547, it was announced that there was to be a general visitation of the churches undertaken. England was divided into 6 circuits. The royal commissioners were to question the parish clergy on their compliance with the injunctions, and they made sure that the English litany was in use. The priests had stopped talking about the Bishop of Rome as the head of the church, that there is no more images in use, so on and so forth. The commissioners also make sure that there were no more ancient festivals or church ales to raise money for the church, and all festivals and celebrations of saints were also stopped. Slowly, the great festivals of the ancient church were silenced. Processions of Corpus Christi celebrating the Eucharist, done. The May Games of Robin Hood, gone. The Hocktide Easter, where members of the opposite sex tied each other up only to be released with kisses as payment, stopped. No more rituals involving boys dressing up like bishops as parodies, and churches no longer to be decorated with flowers. Religious guilds, outlawed. Old pageant plays. The churches are now whitewashed with lime and chalk. The crucifix replaced by the royal arms. 10 Commandments replacing the frescoes. The Orthodox conservatives said the churches are barns, not places of worship, but many found them places where the Psalms could be read along the Bibles and sermons could be heard. Everything was fundamentally different than what had come before. But by the winter of 1547, it was known that lay piety declined. Churches stopped being built. Stephen Gardiner, excluded from the Regency Council, spoke out against the changes, denouncing them, saying he did not care what happened to him. He wrote to Edward Seymour asking that the work of reform stop until Edward could officially rule on his own. He wrote to Thomas Cranmer to debate some of the doctrines that Cranmer was preaching. All of this resulted in Gardiner being summoned to the Regency Council and told, obey the new injunctions or shut the heck up. He refused. He was sent to Fleet Prison along with his cook and 2 servants. There he found Edmund Bonner, Bishop of London, and there he heard again The North was beginning to boil over, and it was feared by the reformers that rebellion was again at hand. Now, Somerset was, first and foremost, a soldier, a man who loved war. From the earliest days of his protectorate, he had been concerned with the defenses on the southern coast and along the Scottish border. He had risen to Henry's notice by a successful invasion of Scotland, you remember, and an effective border raid, and now his eyes turned towards Scotland once again. Shortly after King James V had died, Henry VIII had made it his goal to have his son, Prince Edward, now King Edward VI, and Mary, Queen of Scots, now the Queen of Scotland, marry. Now this is extremely unlikely. And so between 1543, when Henry came up with this idea, and 1549, English soldiers had been sent into Scotland to force the Scots to agree to the match, an event that is known in history as the Rough Wooing. Somerset dreamed that this could still occur. He foresaw a day when Scotland and England would form the Kingdom of Great Britain, united in the strength of reformed religion. Somerset was a rough man. He gave orders. He didn't really consult with others. He chose to rely upon proclamations. For instance, as his method of ordination, he issued 77 of them in under 3 years. These varied from decrees against hoarding grain to regulating the price of meat. They did not need the Regency Council to approve them, and almost every case was accompanied by threats of severe punishment if he didn't follow them. And because these proclamations, he was hated for his arrogance. He was hated because he considered himself king above the rule of law. He was a greedy man, acquiring an unknown number of church properties and estates. In the spring of 1547, for instance, he began building a place at the top of the Strand that has become known as the Somerset House. To do this, he pulled down 3 palaces of bishops in the parish church of St. Mary le Strand to make room. He blew up part of the church of St. John of Jerusalem in Clerkenwell so that he had stone to build with. He looted St. Paul's Cathedral. But at the time, it seemed God favored Somerset. In August 1547, after a long round of inconclusive negotiation with the Scots, he invaded Scotland once more. I said Somerset, not God. Okay, Somerset invaded Scotland. Now that move had as much to do with France as with Scotland. In 1545, the old enemy of Henry, Francois I, had died and been replaced on the throne by his son, Henri II, who had made it his goal to reclaim Boulogne, which had been ceded to Henry VIII by the Treaty of Ardèche, even though England had permission to control this town until 1554, when it would be able to sell it back to France for a large fee of 2 million French crowns. Henri, however, was a young man who aspired to military glory, and so he readied a war with England. And to get ready for war, he made stronger the old alliance with Scotland. So invading Scotland, Somerset could punish Scotland and show France, don't mess with us. Don't mess with Texas. Or England. On August 31st, 1547, Somerset personally led the English army across the Scottish border with, you guessed it, a proclamation. They had come to defend and maintain the honor of his princely realm. At the Battle of Pinkie Cleugh on September 10th, the Scotch were decisively defeated, losing 10,000 men. The English lost 600. Now, some of those that survived fled to Edinburgh, flinging away their weapons as they ran. Others hid in nearby bogs under the water, only their mouths above, so they could breathe. Somerset returned to England, leaving a forced occupation. It was essentially a defeated nation. It was decided that a number of forts with appropriate garrisons would be established to cow and subdue the Scots. But this caused a financial crisis in England. The cost was greater than the reward. The Scots were not about to give in. Somerset had come back to England quickly because he feared that France would invade while he was away. He had intelligence that Henri II had been asked this very request by the Scottish nobility. He feared the schemes of his younger brother Thomas, who had told Edward VI that Somerset would lose by going into Scotland and spend money in vain. So Somerset returned, because on August 2nd, officially he returned, on August 2nd, 1547, because he had summoned a new parliament to meet on November 4th. The parliament met on November 4th, celebrated a mass with all the important elements sung in English. The first act that this parliament passed was an act that abolished all chantries, which were endowments made in the wills for saying the masses for the sake of the soul. They were deemed a superstition connected with the discredited belief in purgatory, so too bad, Henry. Anyway, the act further stated that all the funds and lands released from being earmarked for the saying of masses after death would be directed to pay for schools. But of course, much of the money went into the treasury to pay for the Scottish War. Now, tradition has grown up that Edward VI endowed many schools, but recent histories have shown that a number of schools that say they were established under Edward's realm were established earlier, and all Edward did was simply make a fixed payment to the schoolmaster to replace the fees that they had once received in the dissolved chantries. But there are at least 3 free schools established at St. Albans, Berkhamsted, and Stamford under his reign, and it is known that Trinity College of Cambridge was established in 1546, and Emmanuel College in Cambridge was established in 1584, the latter long after Edward was gone from the scene, but the college was established on land bought for that purpose by Edward. Anyway, now some of the money was used in the usual way. Gifts, bribes, the nobles, the majority going to the ones who made up the Regency Council. And Parliament again proclaimed no candles on Candlemas, no ashes on Ash Wednesday, no palms on Palm Sunday, but they had as much luck as last time they passed the proclamation. Now, showing the reformist inclination of this Parliament, another act was passed, allowing communion of both kinds to be taken by laity. Remember, that means the laity, the common people, could have bread and wine at the communion. And with this change, the vernacular order of communion was introduced and inserted into the Latin Mass. Now, Malmsey wine was given to the better sort. The rest had to do with claret. Okay, it's still wine, right? Anyway, another act was passed that there would be no restriction on printing, teaching, or reading the scriptures. From this time on, bishops were made by the king, making sure the newly evangelized nation had staff of permanent officials. So slowly, the religion of the common people was being changed. This parliament also passed a new Treason Act, repealed the older one imposed by Henry VIII on his sometimes fractious realm. No longer was it be considered treason to simply speak against the king, and more heinous acts now needed 2 witnesses rather than 1 before a case could be taken to court. And in a similar spirit of toleration, Parliament took the Act for the Burning Heretics, passed in 1414, and removed it from the statute book. And the Act of 6 Argylls was abolished as a means of religious toleration. So in the first few months, Parliament had thrown out all the old precautions of treason and heresy, quietly dismantling much of the oppressive laws of Henry VIII. Another act that Parliament passed was the new Regency Act, which ordered into slavery all those unwilling to work. If a person was brought up to justice by 2 witnesses, and the case was heard by 2 justices of the peace, they could find the person guilty, have the guilty person branded on the chest with a V, sentenced to 2 years of slavery, and driven in chains with whips to his new place of work. Anyone who tried to flee from the sentence would be sentenced to a life of slavery, the first time they tried to flee, and death the second time. Now, we may be disgusted about this act, but it must be remembered that Tudor England at that time was full of vagrants. They roved the country in bands, begging and stealing at will, and the masterless man was suspected of dissolving social order, provoking fresh fears about the future. The law is evidence of the social discipline that was maintained over the nation by means of church visitation and injunctions and, yes, proclamation. Anyone walking free had to be restrained. By the spring of 1548, a atonement of legislation had become a mark of Somerset's rule. His friends warned him, "Move slowly. You will see rebellion." But Somerset ignored these warnings. Now some said when it came to religion, Somerset had gone too far. Others said he had not gone far enough. King Edward VI did not mind a change of religion and was even writing a treatise in French on the subject of papal supremacy. At the same time, Lady Mary was hearing 4 masses a week. Fights broke out in churches and between churches on where people stood on the left radical reformer side or the right conservative side. So by the spring of 1548, because all the trouble the religion was causing, a proclamation was issued by Somerset forbidding any more preaching unless a person was given a license by the crown to do so. And when trouble continued, Somerset ruled no more preaching at all. There was one exception. Stephen Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester, had just been released from Fleet Prison. He was asked by the Regency Council to preach before the king. He was asked to subscribe to the various changes made in religion, which meant he would have to publicly agree to matters he did not agree to, like, for instance, the destruction of images and giving of communion in both kinds. Gardiner said no, but he summoned the court, and he was told by Somerset that if he did not do what he had been asked, he would be deprived of his office as bishop. So he relented, and he agreed to preach on June 29th. And he was told, don't mention the doctrine of transubstantiation. So on June 29th, he stood at the open pulpit in the Privy Garden at Whitehall, Edward VI sitting, listening. In a nearby window, a crowd gathered to hear Gardiner make his peace with the religious changes. Gardiner agreed, preaching that he agreed to the dissolution of the chantries. Although he said it's okay to pray for the souls of the dead, he stated he accepted that rituals and ceremonies were not needed, and he agreed to the reformer viewpoint. But he did state that priests should stay celibate, and he affirmed the doctrine of transubstantiation. After the sermon, he went back on his barge to Southwark. On June 30th, he was arrested and thrown into the Tower of London for willful disobedience. For the next 5 years, he was kept in solitary confinement, chained to the wall. In the middle of all this, Somerset was again busy dealing with Scotland. In early 1548, he issued a public letter to the people of Scotland pleading for the country to unite with England as Great Britain. He insisted that Edward and Mary, Queen of Scots, be married. So it came as a deep shock when he heard that Mary was engaged to Francois, the Dauphin of France. She went to France to live with the royal family. Her mother, Mary of Guise, took over Scotland as Queen Mother. Meanwhile, Henri II still wanted to regain Boulogne, but the overwhelming victory of Somerset at the Battle of Pinkie Cleugh gave him room to think. England also needed to avoid a war with France, as the military campaign would cost way too much money. So in February 1548, the French ambassador to England was called to see the young man, Edward, the young king, Edward of Greenwich, where both watched a mock siege. The two spoke Latin to each other so to better understand each other. In June, the French sent a fleet to Leith, Scotland, to aid the Scottish allies, and the French forces launched raids and defended for England raids that were coming, but both sides stayed away from full-scale battle. But England was very annoyed. The French forces were in Scotland, and Somerset was blamed by the people. Meanwhile, Thomas Seymour had not given up his scheme of advancement. Around that time, Lady Elizabeth had come to live with Catherine Parr. Now, she was 14 years old. She became the love interest of Somerset, who knew stepfather. He would often come to her bedchamber, dressed in his nightgown and slippers, and engaged in playful little romps with her, smacking her on her ass. All in good fun. And soon it became evident that Elizabeth had fallen deeply in love with the Lord High Admiral, who was extremely handsome. But Catherine Parr found each other hugging. Found them hugging one day, and she sent Elizabeth away. It was rumored that Elizabeth was pregnant with Seymour's child, and so the Regency Council was forced to question members of her entourage and found that there was no truth to this matter. And then in September 1548, Catherine Parr died, days after she gave birth to a baby girl named Mary. And soon Thomas Seymour turned his attention again to Lady Elizabeth, but he was told by a friend, be careful. You don't want to be killed for trying to marry over your station. But Seymour decided he was going to notice advice. He decided he needed to act upon Edward personally, so he saw him, saying he hoped that when Edward turned 16 and was able to form his own Privy Council, he would be named Lord High Chancellor. Edward told him no. Now Seymour continued plotting, and he fortified his dwelling, Holt Castle in Worcestershire, getting ready for a possible siege by placing stores of beer, wheat, and beef in the cellar. He somehow managed to get a copy of the key that let him have access to the Privy Garden and the King's Lodging and Whitehall. He began to travel back and forth between Holt Castle and Whitehall with a number of friends. And on January 16th, 1549, he managed to get just outside the royal bedchamber before the king's dog barked. And he was arrested for trying to kidnap the king, for trying to raise a private army, and trying to take over the royal mint. All of these charges resulted in him being charged with the crime of treason. The next day, he was taken to Tower London. He pleaded with his brother to spare him. His brother ignored him. And Seymour soon found out that not only had his friends in the Regency Council distanced themselves, but the king had turned against him. Now, in the inquiry that resulted, his designs on Lady Elizabeth was formally investigated, resulting in 3 of Elizabeth's ladies being fired. And Seymour continued his schemes. He wrote 2 letters, which he smuggled out to Lady Mary and Lady Elizabeth, but the letters discovered before they could reach the 2 ladies. On February 25th, Edward VI told the Regency Council to send a bill of attainder for treason to Parliament. On March 20th, Seymour was taken to Tower Hill and beheaded. Somerset had signed the death warrant, but he had not taken part in the parliamentary proceedings against his younger brother. But he was blamed by many, who hoped that with one brother gone, the next would soon fall. Now, in the next few episodes, we're going to look at the end of Edward's reign, and we'll look at the reign of Lady Jane Grey, and we will look at the reign of Queen Mary. And then we're finally going to turn to the final Tudor, the greatest Tudor of them all, Queen Elizabeth I. So my friends, thank you. Stay tuned.